Why is understanding narratives interesting for behavioral economists?
Narratives as a concept is something that hasn't been very prominent in economics until recently, and we've been trying to explore how this concept might be included into economics. And I think, taking a step back, I think it's a concept that's used a lot in everyday language. So people talk about narratives a lot, and they use the term in everyday language a lot. And I think that we can, when we are trying to understand human behavior, which is what behavioral economists are typically trying to do, I think that we can draw a lot on the common wisdom that is present in everyday language. And I think that the fact that economists haven't really been including the concept into the way that we've been trying to understand human behavior is perhaps an omission. Taking another perspective, there's many other social sciences, and in almost all of these other social sciences, the concept of a narrative does play an important role. And I think that economists should learn a lot from other social sciences. And so, what we're trying to do in the project that we work on is to explore one dimension of why narratives might be important for economic decision making.
What do you work on in your project and with whom?
So the project that I've been working on narratives until now is joint work with Tillman Fries, and we're working on a project which is entitled Narrative Persuasion. And in that project, what we're doing is we're looking at how one individual might try to shape how another individual interprets objective information. So there's information that both people have access to, and they need to interpret the information, and one of the individuals might try to shape how the other person interprets the information because they want to shift their beliefs about something.
What did you investigate in the experiment you conducted on narrative persuasion?
So in that experiment, what we consider is the context of a financial advice experiment. So you have advisors and investors, and the advisors are trying to shape how the investor interprets objective information about a company. So both the advisors and the investors have access to historical information about a fictitious company, and the advisors may be trying to influence how the investors are interpreting this information, because the advisors might have a conflict of interest, or they might not have a conflict of interest. And so those that have a conflict of interest, for example, might want to convince the investor that the company is actually better than it is, or that it has better prospects in the future than what it actually does. And they do this by providing a narrative, which is an explanation of the historical information from the company. And in the project, we document several findings. So firstly, we show that individuals are really susceptible to narratives. So we show that the investors are susceptible to the narratives that they receive from the advisors. And they are susceptible to being persuaded by these narratives, even if they know that the advisor has a conflict of interest. And they're also susceptible to being persuaded by these narratives, even if they know that the advisor does not have more information about the company than they have, right? So that's, quite an interesting finding. And then we also, we build on theoretical work by Josh Schwartzin and Adi Sundaram. And so we look at the role of narrative fit. So this is how coherent is the narrative to the available objective information. So how coherent is the narrative in relation to the facts that the investor and the advisor have available to them. And we show that this notion of narrative fit is very important for whether the investors are persuaded by narrative. So when narratives fit very well, then investors are more likely to be persuaded by the narrative that they receive from the advisor. The third finding is that when we shift attention to the advisor side, so these are the persuaders, the individuals that are proposing the narratives, we find that these advisors are somewhat sophisticated in the way that they construct the narratives. So they anticipate that investors care about the narrative fit, and so they tailor the narratives that they construct such that they trade off trying to persuade the investor to believe something that they want the investor to believe, and making sure that their narrative is fitting the data well so that it is coherent with the data. So they try and trade off these two, the tension between these two motives that they face in order to shift the investor's belief, but also propose a narrative that the investor will find plausible and be willing to believe. And then finally, we also look at competition between narratives. So we look at what happens when there's a competing narrative present. How does this influence the narratives that the advisors propose? And we show that the advisors in our experiment react to competing narratives when they are present. So they become more constrained in the narratives that they can construct when the competing narrative fits very well. But when the competing narrative fits poorly, then the advisors have more flexibility to construct narratives that shift the investors' beliefs even further because they are competing with a worse fitting narrative, so to speak.
What implications do your findings have for economic theory and experimental work going forward?
Narrowly, we provide some support for the theoretic work by Josh Schwartzin and Adi Sundaram. We demonstrate that narratives are important for persuasion. So, we show that individuals are susceptible to narratives. So when they're provided with this narrative interpretation of facts that they have available to them, this does shift the way that they interpret the facts. And I think that this is important to show. We provide an experimental framework, so a paradigm that I think could be used by other researchers to also explore questions related to narratives and narrative persuasion. But more broadly, I think, as I mentioned before, we are part of a group of researchers that are exploring questions related to narratives at the moment. And I find it very, interesting and exciting to be part of this group of researchers. And, this group of researchers collectively are asking questions such as, what are the characteristics that make narratives believable or make individuals more likely to adopt a narrative? What kinds of narratives are more persuasive? And, collectively, I think that this body of research is showing that there is an important role for narratives to play in the way that we understand economic decision making, because you have a bunch of different conceptualizations of what a narrative is, and each of them seems to capture an interesting dimension of human behavior.